The scent hit her before the sound did. Pine needles, damp earth, and the unmistakable, heavy copper of fresh blood. 5 years of mountain silence shattered in an instant. She didn't reach for her wolf. She reached for the iron skinning knife. An alpha was bleeding on her porch. The cold was a living thing in the Scarran Mountains. It didn't just chill the skin. It burrowed under the fingernails, settled into the marrow, and stayed there until the brief, muddy thaw of June. For a wolf without a pack, the cold was worse. The internal furnace that kept bonded wolves radiating heat was broken in Bryony. It had shattered the day her alpha drove her from the territory with a torn ear and a severed bond. Now, she survived on layers of cured deer, hide, and spite. Bryony knelt in the dirt in front of her cabin, hands slick with the grease of a gutted hare. The air was sharp, biting at her exposed cheeks. She worked the flint knife with practiced, brutal efficiency. Slice the tendon, peel the skin back, snap the joint. Her hands were calloused, the knuckles split and stained brown from walnut husks and dried blood. She didn't look like an Omega. Omegas were supposed to be soft things, round-faced and pliant, smelling of milk and honey. Bryony smelled of wood ash, rendered fat, and old sweat. She tossed the pale, skinned carcass into a wooden bucket and wiped her hands on her thigh. The sky above the tree line was the color of a bruised plum. Snow was coming. The heavy, suffocating kind that would bury the game trails and lock her inside the stone and timber cabin for weeks. She needed more wood. As she stood, her left knee popped an old injury from her exile that never set right. She ignored it, grabbing the heavy iron axe resting against the chopping block. The repetitive thwack of iron-splitting pine became a rhythm. It drowned out the suffocating quiet of the woods. The silence up here wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of a held breath, a constant, paranoid waiting. Then, the woods exhaled. It started with the birds. A sudden, chaotic scattering of crows from the high canopy, their harsh caws cutting through the frigid air. Bryony paused, the axe suspended above her head. She lowered it slowly, the iron head resting silently on the wood block. She closed her eyes and pulled the air past her palate, tasting the wind. Wet fur, iron, fear. The scent was thick, chaotic, and entirely wrong for this altitude. Wolves didn't come this high. The territory below belonged to the Valerius pack, a sprawling, arrogant family of lowland wolves who despised the jagged, sterile crags of the Scarrans. But this scent wasn't lowland. It was dark and suffocatingly heavy. Alpha. Bryony's heart gave a single, violent kick against her ribs. Her wolf, dormant and starved for years, stirred with a pathetic whine. She shoved the animal down with a mental strike. No, she didn't run. Running triggered the chase instinct. Instead, she moved with deliberate, terrifying calm. She left the chopped wood, grabbed her hunting crossbow from the rack beside the heavy oak door, and stepped inside. She didn't bolt the door immediately. She left it open a fraction, just enough to slot the iron-tipped quarrel through the gap. She waited in the gloom. The fire in the hearth snapped, spitting a glowing ember onto the stone. The sounds grew closer. Not the fluid, silent stalking of a hunter. It was a dragging, desperate rhythm. Crunch. Drag. Pause. Crunch. A wet, rattling cough echoed through the bare winter trees. Through the narrow crack in the door, a figure broke the tree line. He was massive, even hunched over, dragging his left leg. His sheer width blocked out the fading afternoon light. He wore armor, which was strange enough, with thick plates of boiled leather and chainmail, common for border skirmishes but unheard of here. The mail was sheared open at the ribs, exposing a dark, wet ruin of flesh. Bryony tightened her grip on the crossbow. The trigger dug into her calloused finger. He staggered, a hand the size of a dinner plate slamming against the trunk of a dead birch to keep himself upright. His breathing was a horrific, bubbling sound. He wasn't just an alpha. The sheer density of his pheromones, even masked by the stench of his own dying body, was overwhelming. It made Bryony's teeth ache. It was a king scent, dominance baked into the cellular level, but he wasn't acting like a king. He was looking down, tucked into the crook of his uninjured arm, pressed fiercely against the undamaged side of his chest, was a bundle of coarse gray wool. Bryony narrowed her eyes. The wind shifted, blowing directly from him to her porch. Beneath the overwhelming stink of alpha blood and ruptured organs, there was something else. Milk. Fear. The powdery, helpless scent of an infant pup. The giant pushed off the tree. He took 3 more steps toward her cabin, his head lifting. His eyes met the crack in her door. They weren't glowing with alpha command. 1. They were a dull, bloodshot amber, ringed with exhausted gray. He didn't demand entry. He didn't order her to open the door. He simply stopped at the edge of the porch, swayed like a felled oak, and crashed to his knees. The ground actually shuddered. Bryony didn't move. She held the crossbow steady, aiming right for the gap in his armor. Die there, she thought, the cynicism a hard, cold stone in her chest. Die and leave me alone. The man lifted his head one last time. His lips, pale and cracked, parted. "Not me," he rasped, his voice sounding like stones grinding together under deep water. He extended the woolen bundle forward, laying it carefully on the freezing dirt of her steps. "Take him." Then, the Alpha King collapsed, face first, into the snow, motionless. For 10 long minutes, the only sound was the wind whining through the chinks in the cabin walls. Bryony watched the massive body bleeding out on her steps. He didn't twitch. The bundle of wool beside his head, however, shifted. A tiny, muffled whimper broke the silence. She cursed. It wasn't a delicate, feminine swear. It was a guttural, ugly sound, born of profound frustration. Lowering the crossbow, she pulled the heavy iron bar from the door and stepped out into the biting cold. The smell was immediately overpowering. The porch looked like a slaughterhouse floor. The man's blood was steaming in the frigid air, melting the light dusting of frost on the wood. Bryony nudged his heavy leather boot with the toe of her own. Nothing. She crouched, keeping her knife drawn, and grabbed the edge of the gray wool. She flipped it back. A pup, no more than 6 months old, stared up at her. He was terrified, his chubby face smeared with the alpha's blood, his small hands clutching the wool so tightly his knuckles were white. He didn't cry out. He just stared at her with wide, traumatized blue eyes. An Omega's biology is a cruel, uncompromising master. Despite the years of isolation, despite the callousness she had built to survive, a physical pain lanced through Bryony's chest at the sight of the pup. Her breasts ached, her throat tightened. It was a biological imperative screaming at her to scoop the child up, to warm him, to hide him. She hated it. She resented the instinct violently, but her hands moved anyway. She hauled the pup out of the freezing wool by his scruff, carrying him like a feral dog would carry her young. She marched inside, dumped him onto the sheepskin rug near the hearth, and pointed a finger at him. "Stay." The pup curled into a tight ball, shivering violently, but didn't make a sound. Bryony marched back outside. Now came the nightmare. She looked at the mountain of a man. If she left him here, he would die, and his rotting corpse would attract scavengers, bears, mountain cats, or worse, whoever had done this to him. If she pushed him off the ridge, he'd still leave a blood trail straight to her door. She gritted her teeth, grabbed him by the epaulets of his ruined armor, and pulled. It was like trying to drag a boulder. Her bad knee screamed in protest. Her boots slipped in his blood. Swearing continuously under her breath, she repositioned, grabbing his heavy leather belt instead, and heaved backward. Inch by inch, she dragged him across the threshold. The floorboards groaned. By the time she got him entirely inside and kicked the door shut, she was drenched in sweat, her lungs burning. She dropped his belt, staggering back to lean against the wall. The cabin was entirely changed. It was small to begin with, But with this beast bleeding out in the center of the floor, it felt claustrophobic. His scent dominated everything. The delicate smells of her dried yarrow and mint were obliterated by the stench of wet alpha, blood, and impending death. She stood over him, chest heaving, knife still in hand. He was undeniably a king. The tattoos running up his neck and disappearing behind his ear marked him as royalty from the northern reaches Gideon's line. The wolves of the deep ice. What was a northern king doing in the Scarrans, thousands of miles from his snow-choked citadel, holding a pup? "Not my problem," Bryony muttered. She stepped over his massive, limp arm to get to her work table. She needed to stop the bleeding, not out of compassion, but because she didn't want to scrub his lifeblood out of her floorboards for the next month. She boiled water in an iron kettle over the hearth. The pup watched her with wide, unblinking eyes from the rug. He hadn't moved an inch. "Don't look at me like that," she snapped at the child, tossing a rag into the boiling water. "I'm not your mother." She returned to the man. Rolling him onto his back took a sickening amount of leverage. When he flopped over, his head lolled back, revealing a face, pale beneath layers of grime. His jaw was square and covered in a thick, dark scruff. A jagged scar bisected his left eyebrow. He looked brutal, even in unconsciousness. Bryony took a pair of heavy fabric shears and began cutting away the leather and mail. The sound of metal snapping and leather tearing filled the room. When she peeled the armor back, she hissed through her teeth. The wound wasn't from a blade. It was a claw mark. 3 deep, jagged trenches tore diagonally across his ribs, shredding muscle and scraping bone. The edges were angry, swollen, and weeping a noxious black fluid. Wolfsbane. Someone had laced their claws with poison. No wonder a king was dying from a flesh wound. The poison was eating through his accelerated healing, turning his blood to sludge. She rocked back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of a bloody hand. To cure wolfsbane, she needed silver leaf and charcoal, packed directly into the wound. It would burn like the fires of hell. If he woke up while she was doing it, he would likely thrash, and a single backhand from a man this size would break her neck. She looked at the pup. The pup looked at the dying alpha, then at Bryony. A single tear cut a clean track down his dirty cheek. Bryony closed her eyes, fighting the war in her head. Survival said, "Slit the alpha's throat now. Take the pup to the nearest village and disappear." But her wolf, the broken, pathetic thing inside her, whined. "Fine," she spat at the unconscious giant. "But if you bite me, I'm taking your eye." The cabin smelled like a butcher's block that had been set on fire. Bryony knelt over the massive chest of the unconscious alpha, her hands stained black with charcoal and crushed silver leaf. She had spent the last 2 hours packing the noxious paste deep into the torn grooves of his flesh. Every time the paste made contact with the poisoned blood, it hissed, sending a plume of acrid white smoke into the air. He hadn't woken, but his body had fought her. His muscles would spasm violently, a low, demonic growl vibrating up from his chest cavity, rattling Bryony's bones. Each time, she had to press her entire body weight against his arm to keep him from thrashing and tearing the wound open further. The physical contact was agonizing for her. An omega without a pack is starved for touch, but it's a twisted, painful starvation. Feeling the hard, burning heat of an alpha's skin under her hands made her own skin crawl with a mix of desperate craving and sheer panic. Her biology screamed to submit, to bare her throat, to seek comfort. Her mind, hardened by years of isolation and betrayal, wanted to plunge her skinning knife into his chest to make the confusing feelings stop. She bound the ribs tightly with strips of boiled linen, tying the knot with vicious, unnecessary force. "Done," she muttered, sitting back on her heels and wiping her blackened hands on a rag. Outside, the storm had finally broken. The wind howled like a dying animal, throwing handfuls of icy snow against the heavy wooden shutters. The temperature in the cabin was dropping, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. Bryony looked over at the pup. He had finally fallen asleep, curled into a tight, miserable ball on the sheepskin rug. He had refused the dried meat she offered, refusing to eat, refusing to speak. She sighed, a rattling sound in her own chest, and moved to the heavy oak chair by the fire. She didn't sleep. She sat with her crossbow across her knees, watching the giant's chest rise and fall. The rattling in his breath had eased. The silver leaf was drawing the poison out. He was going to live, which meant she had a massive, unpredictable problem on her floor. It happened hours later, deep into the night when the fire had burned down to pulsing red embers. First, the rhythm of his breathing changed. It shifted from the deep, slow pull of the unconscious to the sharp, controlled intake of someone awake and assessing their surroundings. Bryony's grip tightened on the crossbow stock. She didn't move a muscle. The alpha's eyelids fluttered, then opened. In the dim, ruddy light of the embers, his eyes were startling. Not the bloodshot amber from before, but a deep, piercing gold that seemed to generate its own light. He didn't thrash. He didn't gasp. He simply lay perfectly still, his eyes tracking the wooden beams of the ceiling, the stone of the hearth, and finally, stopping on Bryony in the corner. For a long moment, neither moved. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Bryony could feel the heavy, oppressive wave of his aura rolling over her, demanding submission. It wasn't intentional on his part. It was simply the reality of what he was. Bryony pushed back against it, baring her teeth in a silent, feral sneer. She refused to lower her gaze. The alpha's golden eyes narrowed slightly. He shifted his weight, testing the bindings on his ribs. He winced, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth, but his focus remained locked on her. "Where is he?" His voice was a gravelly ruin, barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a command. "By the fire," Bryony replied. Her voice was rusty from disuse, harsh and flat. The alpha slowly turned his head. When he saw the pup, alive and breathing steadily on the rug, the oppressive, suffocating weight of his aura vanished instantly. The sudden absence of pressure made Bryony dizzy. He let his head fall back against the floorboards, a long, ragged sigh escaping his lips. "You saved him." "I brought him inside," Bryony corrected coldly. "I don't know who you are. And I don't care. As soon as the storm breaks, you're taking him and you're leaving." The giant turned his head back to her, studying her in the dim light. His eyes dragged over her ragged clothes, her unkempt hair, the dirt on her face, and finally, the heavy crossbow aimed squarely at his chest. He took a slow, deep breath through his nose, scenting the air. Bryony stiffened. She knew what he smelled. The lack of a pack bond. The stale, sour scent of an outcast. "You're an Omega," he stated. It wasn't an insult, just an observation. "I'm the one holding a loaded weapon," she shot back, her finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. "My biology is irrelevant." A ghost of a smirk touched the corner of his cracked lips. It was a dark, cynical expression. "I am Gideon," he said, his voice gaining a fraction of its strength. "King of the northern reaches." "Congratulations," Bryony deadpanned. "I'm Bryony, queen of this cabin. And right now, your majesty is bleeding on my floor. Don't make sudden movements." Gideon didn't look angry at her insolence. If anything, he looked weary, bone deep, soul-crushingly tired. He looked away from her, staring into the dying embers. "I have nothing to offer you for your sanctuary, Bryony," he murmured, his eyes reflecting the red light of the fire. "My pack is dead. My kingdom is burned. That pup is the last of my bloodline." Bryony's heart skipped a beat, but she forced her face to remain a mask of cold indifference. A slaughtered pack meant enemies. Enemies who left claw marks laced with wolfsbane. Enemies who would follow a blood trail. She had led a war into her home. "Like I said," Bryony whispered, the absolute terror of the situation hardening her voice into ice. "As soon as the storm breaks, you leave." The blizzard didn't break the next morning. It raged for 3 relentless days, burying the cabin up to the windowsills in a suffocating prison of white. Inside, the air grew thick. It tasted of stale wood smoke, dried sweat, and the overwhelming, undeniable musk of a dominant alpha, confined to a space the size of a woodshed. For Bryony, the claustrophobia was physical. Her skin felt too tight. Her nerves were frayed wires, sparking every time Gideon shifted his massive weight on the floorboards. He had dragged himself from the center of the room to the wall beside the hearth, leaning against the rough-hewn logs. He barely fit there. His legs, thick as tree trunks, stretched halfway across the room. He spent most of the time drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, fighting the lingering effects of the wolfsbane. The pup, whom Gideon called Leo, had finally stopped trembling. Hunger had overridden his trauma. Bryony sat at her work table, aggressively scraping the remaining meat from a rabbit pelt. She watched the child from the corner of her eye. Leo was sitting by Gideon's knee, gnawing on a piece of tough, dried venison Bryony had tossed onto the rug. The pup chewed with small, determined grunts. "You'll break his teeth," a rough voice rasped. Bryony paused her scraping. She didn't look up. He's a wolf. He needs to learn to chew through gristle. Unless northern royalty feeds their pups pureed grouse. Gideon let out a breath that might have been a laugh, ending in a wet cough. He pressed a hand to his bandaged ribs, his face paling beneath the grime. "We feed them well enough. But usually with meat that hasn't been cured into shoe leather." "My cabin. My shoe leather," Bryony retorted, slamming the iron scraper down. She wiped her greasy hands on a rag and stood. Her bad knee popped loudly in the quiet room. Gideon's golden eyes tracked the sound, dipping to her leg, then rising to her face. He didn't ask. Bryony hated him a little more for that. Pity she could fight. Silent, analytical observation made her feel exposed. She walked to the hearth, grabbed an iron pot of melted snow, and poured it over a handful of crushed oats. She stirred it aggressively until it formed a thick, gray paste. She didn't want to do this. Every instinct screamed at her to maintain her distance, to keep the walls of her isolation intact. But the pup was small, and the venison really was too hard. She walked over and knelt out of striking distance of the alpha. She shoved the wooden bowl toward Leo. "Eat," she commanded, her voice flat. Leo dropped the venison. He looked at the bowl, then up at Bryony with wide, cautious blue eyes. Slowly, he reached out with a chubby, dirt-stained hand and scooped up a dollop of the warm oats. He shoved it into his mouth. A second later, he was eating with both hands, making a mess of his chin and the wool blanket. Bryony felt that cruel, unwanted tightening in her chest again. She scowled, turning her face away from the pup, only to find Gideon watching her. "You smell like conflict," Gideon said softly. The gravel in his voice was smoothed out by exhaustion. "I smell like rabbit grease," Bryony snapped, pushing herself up. "You smell like a bonded mother fighting her own nature," Gideon corrected, his tone shifting into something heavier. "An alpha's truth. Your wolf wants to nest. You want to run." Bryony froze. Her hand dropped to the hilt of the skinning knife at her belt. The silence in the cabin suddenly felt lethal. "Do not psychoanalyze my scent, King," she whispered, her voice vibrating with a genuine, cornered rage. "You don't know what I am." "I know you're an exile," Gideon said, unblinking. He didn't flinch at the threat. "I see the torn ear. I smell the dead bond. Your alpha drove you out." "My alpha tried to kill me because I wouldn't breed with a beta twice my age to settle a border dispute," Bryony spat, the words tearing out of her throat before she could stop them. The old ugly truth felt like ash on her tongue. I fought back. He broke my knee and severed the bond. So don't talk to me about my nature. My nature got me a death sentence. Gideon didn't offer empty apologies. He didn't give her a look of soft, patronizing sympathy. He just looked at her, his jaw tightening, processing the tactical reality of her survival. "He was a weak leader," Gideon finally said. "A true alpha does not sell his pack to buy peace, and he does not discard a wolf with your spine." Bryony stared at him, thrown entirely off balance. She had expected disgust. Omegas were supposed to be compliant. A violent, defiant Omega was a broken tool, something to be discarded. Before she could form a retort, the wind outside stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading. The howling simply ceased, leaving a ringing, profound silence in its wake. The storm had broken. Bryony turned toward the window, her heart hammering a sudden, erratic rhythm against her ribs. She moved to the shutters, pressing her eye against the narrow crack. The world outside was blindingly white. The sun was glaring off the fresh, untouched powder. "The snow stopped," she murmured. "Then we will leave," Gideon grunted, attempting to push himself up the wall. His massive shoulders bunched, muscles straining under the bandages. He got halfway to his feet before a sickening rip echoed in the cabin. Gideon went terrifyingly pale, his eyes rolling back as he collapsed hard against the timber wall. Fresh, bright red blood bloomed rapidly across the white linen wrapping his ribs. "Stupid, stubborn bastard," Bryony cursed, rushing forward. She dropped to her knees beside him, pressing her hands hard against the bleeding wound. His skin was cold, clammy with shock. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. "I said. I would leave," he rasped, his eyes barely open. "You're not going anywhere except a shallow grave if you bleed out on my floor," Bryony hissed, pressing harder. Her hands were covered in his blood again, the heavy, metallic scent filling the small space. She looked from the bleeding giant to the terrified pup whimpering in the corner. Then she looked at the heavy oak door. The storm was over. The tracks were buried. But kings didn't fall without making a noise, and hunters didn't stop until they saw a corpse. They were coming. And Bryony was stuck with a crippled alpha and a crying pup. The thaw came fast, turning the mountain into a treacherous landscape of dripping pines and slush. 3 days after the storm broke, Bryony heard the sound she had been dreading for 5 years. It wasn't the crunch of an animal. It was the synchronized, heavy footfalls of boots breaking through the icy crust of the snow. Bryony stood perfectly still by the work table, a strip of dried meat halfway to her mouth. She lowered it slowly. She closed her eyes and tasted the air seeping through the chinks in the logs. Sour sweat, leather treated with cheap tallow, and beneath it all, the aggressive, acidic stench of rogue alphas. 3 of them. "They're here," she said. Her voice was a ghost in the quiet cabin. Gideon was sitting up in the armchair, his face drawn and pale. He had regained some strength, enough to hold a blade, but his body was still fighting the lingering poison. He couldn't shift into his wolf form. The transformation would tear his healing ribs to shreds and bleed him out in seconds. He didn't ask questions. He reached for the heavy iron broadsword leaning against the hearth. The scrape of metal against stone was loud. "Get the boy in the root cellar," Gideon commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The king was awake. Bryony didn't argue. She moved fast, lifting the heavy iron ring of the trapdoor hidden under the sheepskin rug. The cellar was small, dark, and smelled of potatoes and damp earth. She grabbed Leo by the back of his tunic and lowered him into the hole. "Do not make a sound," she whispered fiercely, staring into his terrified blue eyes. "If you cry, we die. Understand?" Leo nodded once, his small hands clamping over his own mouth. Bryony slammed the heavy wooden door shut and kicked the rug over it. She moved to the weapon rack. She didn't take the crossbow. Close quarters made it a liability after the first shot. Instead, she unhooked a heavy boar spear with a crossguard, the ash wood shaft polished smooth from use. She slipped her favorite skinning knife into her boot. "They followed the scent of the blood," Gideon said, leaning heavily on his sword, using it like a cane to stand. His breathing was already labored. "They are assassins, the king killers." "They're idiots for coming up the front path," Bryony replied, her voice eerily calm. Adrenaline was a cold, sharp clarity in her veins. Outside, a voice called out. It was mocking. laced with the smug certainty of a predator who has cornered its prey. "Come out, Your Majesty. The snow is too deep to run. Hand over the pup, and we'll make it quick." Bryony looked at Gideon. "Can you hold the door?" Gideon nodded, his jaw set, his golden eyes flashing with a suppressed, violent light. "I will hold it until my heart stops." "Good," Bryony said, "because I'm going out the back." She slipped toward the rear of the cabin, unbarring the small, reinforced window she used for tossing out slops. She slid through it silently, dropping into the deep snowdrift banked against the back wall. The cold bit through her wool trousers instantly. She crawled on her belly, keeping beneath the snow line, circling around the perimeter of her home. She peeked around the corner of the firewood stack. 3 men stood in the clearing before her porch. They were massive, heavily scarred wolves in human form, wearing piecemeal armor and carrying heavy axes. They were focused entirely on the front door, their backs to the tree line. "Break it down," the leader barked. The largest of the 3 stepped forward, raising a maul. Bryony didn't hesitate. She stepped out from behind the wood stack, planted her feet in the slush, and threw the boar spear with every ounce of strength in her shoulders. The heavy iron tip caught the tracker directly under the armpit, punching through boiled leather and burying itself deep in his chest cavity. He didn't even scream. He simply folded, dropping the maul as he hit the snow with a wet thud. The other 2 spun around, their eyes wide with shock. They had expected an injured king. They hadn't expected a feral Omega. "Bitch!" the leader roared, his eyes flashing wolf yellow. He charged her, raising his axe. Bryony didn't freeze. She dropped to her good knee, dragging a hidden tripwire she had strung between the woodblock and the porch stairs months ago for wild boar. The charging alpha hit the wire. His boots flew out from under him, and he crashed face first onto the frozen edge of the chopping block. The sickening crack of breaking bone echoed in the clearing. But the 3rd tracker was faster. He leaped over his fallen companion, closing the distance before Bryony could draw her knife. He slammed into her, his sheer mass throwing her backward into the snow. The air exploded from her lungs. Heavy hands clamped around her throat, squeezing with crushing, unnatural force. Bryony gagged, her vision swimming with black spots. She clawed at his wrists, her nails digging into his thick skin, but it was like trying to peel iron. He leaned down, his foul breath hot on her face, his canines extending. "Going to tear your throat out, little mutt." The front door of the cabin exploded outward in a shower of splintered oak. Gideon didn't run. He lunged. He was a moving mountain of muscle and rage. He moved with a terrifying, brutal speed that defied his injuries. He didn't use the sword. He hit the tracker, straddling Bryony with his bare hands. One hand clamped onto the back of the assassin's neck, the other grabbed his belt. With a guttural roar that shook the snow from the pine branches, Gideon ripped the man off Bryony and hurled him through the air. The assassin smashed into the trunk of a pine tree 10 feet away, his spine snapping with a sound like a dry branch breaking. He fell in a heap and didn't move. Bryony rolled onto her side, coughing violently, sucking freezing air into her burning lungs. She looked up. Gideon stood in the center of the bloody snow, his chest heaving. His bandages were completely soaked through, fresh blood pouring down his stomach. He swayed violently, his golden eyes dimming. He looked down at Bryony, a strange, profound respect in his gaze. "You fight like a king," he whispered. Then, his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed backward into the snow. Bryony scrambled to her feet, her throat aching, her knee screaming in agony. She checked the 3 bodies. Dead. All of them. She stood alone in the absolute silence of the mountain, surrounded by blood. She looked at her cabin. The door was shattered. The blood trail was obvious. More would come. If not tomorrow, then next week. Her sanctuary was gone. Her isolation, the cold, miserable peace she had built out of spite, was over. She walked back into the ruined cabin, pulled the rug aside, and opened the cellar door. Leo looked up at her in the gloom, his face streaked with tears, but silent. "Come on," Brioni said, her voice rough. She reached a blood-stained hand down to him. "We have to pack." 2 hours later, the mountain sky was choked with thick, black smoke. Bryony stood at the tree line, watching her home of 5 years burn. The flames licked the gray sky, consuming the timber, the sheepskins, the silence. She had set the fire herself. It would hide the scent of their escape and leave the hunters nothing but ashes. Beside her, Gideon leaned heavily against a makeshift crutch she had fashioned from a sapling. He carried Leo strapped to his chest in a sling made from blankets. The king looked terrible, practically dead on his feet, but his jaw was set with unyielding resolve. He turned his head to look at her. The firelight danced in his golden eyes. "You didn't have to burn it. You could have stayed. I would have drawn them away." Bryony adjusted the heavy pack on her shoulders, the strap biting into her collarbone. She looked at the burning cabin, feeling a strange, terrifying sense of relief beneath the grief. The cold furnace inside her, the one that had been broken for so long, felt a tiny, flickering spark of warmth. "I'm an Omega," Brioni said, turning her back on the fire and facing the vast, brutal expanse of the northern peaks. She looked at the giant king, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to bare her teeth. "And a pack belongs together. Try to keep up, Your Majesty." She stepped onto the unbroken snow, leading the way into the wind. If this gritty tale of survival and unexpected bonds kept you on the edge of your seat, don't let the journey end here. Hit that like button if you loved Bryony's fierce spirit, and share this story with a friend who craves real, grounded werewolf drama. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next dark fantasy adventure. What should happen to them in the north? Let me know in the comments below.